Scrooge McDuck, born in the small Scottish village of Glencoe, rose from humble beginnings. His early life, marked by hard work and frugality, painted a picture of a man driven to succeed. As a young duck, he made a name for himself by earning his first dime, which he kept for the rest of his life. His ambition was insatiable, and his drive for wealth became an obsession. What seemed like a simple desire to build a comfortable life evolved into something much darker. As Scrooge's wealth began to multiply, he expanded his reach far beyond the small businesses he once ran. The world became his playground, and his name spread across continents. From treasure hunts to international deals, Scrooge's influence grew. He was no longer just a wealthy businessman, he had become a global empire, with a vast network of companies, connections, and control over industries that stretched from gold mines to stock exchanges. The moment Scrooge McDuck had amassed a fortune greater than any other, he realized that wealth alone was not enough. Power became the true prize he sought. With his riches, he manipulated markets, influenced governments, and used his position to become an untouchable force. But it wasn't just about wealth anymore, it was about dominance. McDuck's ventures became more aggressive, and his moral compass grew increasingly skewed as he sought to control not just businesses, but entire nations. As he ventured into darker territories, Scrooge's ambitions took a more sinister turn. With the vast influence he held, it was easy for him to start funding shadowy organizations, groups that could aid his global influence. Under the guise of charity work and philanthropic endeavors, McDuck used his vast wealth to fund wars, covert operations, and even acts of terrorism. For Scrooge, the world had become a chessboard, and he was ready to play the ultimate game. For years, Scrooge's empire remained largely unnoticed by the public. His actions were cleverly concealed behind layers of legitimate businesses and high-profile investments. To the outside world, he was a well-respected businessman, a hero in his community, and an icon of success. But beneath this surface was something far more dangerous. The world's wealthiest duck was not simply collecting treasure, he was manipulating events, funding terror, and using his resources to push a global agenda. These groups weren't just about causing destruction for the sake of chaos, they were carefully chosen for their ability to destabilize regions, create economic turmoil, and ultimately allow McDuck to swoop in and seize control. Each conflict he funded was a calculated move in his greater plan of global domination, with no one the wiser about who was truly behind it. Scrooge McDuck's wealth gave him the power to influence entire continents. His network stretched across borders, from the jungles of South America to the mountains of Asia. Wherever there was turmoil, Scrooge saw opportunity. With a combination of blackmail, manipulation, and financial leverage, he turned global unrest into a tool to further his agenda. Countries rich in resources became his playground, their governments mere pawns in his game of control. Through a series of calculated investments, McDuck was able to ensure that political leaders were either beholden to him or directly influenced by his actions. His business dealings often veiled sinister undertones. When a country's infrastructure was destroyed in a conflict, it was often Scrooge who stepped in to rebuild at a price, of course. Each reconstruction project was a silent takeover, cementing his control over vital resources and further entrenching his hold on the world's economic systems. One of Scrooge McDuck's greatest strengths was his ability to play the role of the benevolent philanthropist. His public persona was one of generosity, often donating large sums of money to causes such as education and infrastructure. He built schools, hospitals, and orphanages, gaining the public's trust and admiration. But behind the scenes, these charities were fronts for much darker objectives. The donations were not just about goodwill, they were about control. By establishing these charitable organizations, Scrooge was able to launder money and establish a powerful network of loyalists. Governments were more likely to side with him when he appeared as a benefactor, and ordinary people admired him for his supposed kindness. What they didn't know was that the schools were used to indoctrinate young minds, hospitals served as cover for military operations, and orphanages were the perfect places to recruit future operatives. All the while, McDuck's wealth continued to grow, his grip on the world tightening. Though Scrooge McDuck operated in the shadows, he was far from alone in his quest for control. His network of allies included corrupt politicians, ruthless mercenaries, and former criminal masterminds. These individuals were key to helping him execute his covert operations. Together, they formed a tight-knit group of elites who shared McDuck's vision of a world shaped by wealth and power. Some were motivated by money, while others sought the thrill of power that came with destabilizing governments and controlling economies. Within his network, Scrooge held the strings, and each member had a role to play. While some worked as intermediaries between McDuck and foreign governments, others served as agents who carried out sabotage and terror. They had no idea that they were simply pawns in a much larger game. To McDuck, they were useful tools, but their purpose was ultimately expendable. His mission wasn't just about gaining wealth, it was about orchestrating a world in which he would be the undisputed king. Scrooge McDuck's rise to power coincided with the collapse of old political structures. As economies faltered and governments struggled to maintain control, McDuck swooped in to capitalize on the chaos. With his vast fortune, he was able to fund revolutionaries and even entire factions of insurgents. These groups destabilized countries, causing economic collapses and civil wars. While the world's governments scrambled to regain order, McDuck was already positioning himself as the savior, offering solutions that came at a heavy price. The old world order, once dominated by governments and traditional power structures, began to crumble under the weight of McDuck's influence. Nations that had once been powerful were now mired in debt and conflict, and as governments fell, McDuck's empire grew. It wasn't about controlling a single nation, it was about controlling a network of weak, destabilized states that were ripe for the taking. As Scrooge McDuck's power continued to expand, he set his sights on new territories, those that were rich in resources, but lacked the stability to defend themselves. Africa, Southeast Asia, and parts of South America became prime targets. In these regions, McDuck found both opportunity and vulnerability. By funding rebel groups and encouraging military coups, he ensured that these nations would remain in a perpetual state of unrest, allowing him to step in as both a financier and a savior. The military conflicts that ravaged these regions only played into McDuck's hands. As governments collapsed, private corporations and McDuck's network of operatives took over. Local populations, desperate for any semblance of stability, were forced into deals with McDuck's companies. In return for rebuilding their war-torn nations, they had to surrender control of valuable resources. The world saw Scrooge as a businessman. Few realized he was a puppet master pulling the strings of entire nations. Scrooge McDuck's greatest weapon was not his vast wealth or even his network of operatives. It was the ability to remain unseen, to operate from the shadows while making the world believe that everything was under control. He was not just a businessman, he was a terrorist in the truest sense of the word. His methods of terrorism were not bombs or guns, but financial manipulation, political maneuvering, and psychological control. By the time the world began to realize the depth of McDuck's manipulation, it was too late. His empire had already grown so large that any attempt to stop him would have been futile. Governments, businesses, and even international organizations were all in his pocket, working according to his will. Scrooge McDuck, the once beloved character, had transformed into a dark force, one that reshaped the world in his image, where power and greed ruled all. This format gives a detailed and structured documentary script that unfolds over 20 chapters. Each chapter builds upon the previous one, making the story more comprehensive and immersive. As Scrooge McDuck's empire continued to grow, some of his former allies began to realize the extent of his manipulation. Once seen as a figure of admiration, McDuck's true nature began to surface, and those closest to him started to question their loyalty. Former allies such as his nephews Huey, Dewey, and Louie, who had once believed in their uncle's ethical approach to business, found themselves embroiled in the moral dilemmas of their inheritance. Their growing unease created a rift within the McDuck family. Despite their reservations, the McDuck dynasty had already cemented its place in history, and any attempt to confront the empire's sprawling reach seemed futile. Scrooge's power was now absolute, and those who dared challenge him were either silenced or forced into exile. The empire he had built was not just one of wealth, but of fear and coercion. Scrooge had manipulated both public perception and personal loyalty to ensure that no one could stand in his way, not even his own flesh and blood. As Scrooge McDuck's reign of terror continued, whispers of resistance began to stir. Across the globe, individuals who had once worked for McDuck or suffered under his regime began to organize in secret. Former business partners, disenfranchised citizens, and rebel leaders from destabilized nations started to unite, forming a clandestine group determined to bring down McDuck's empire. These rebels were not just fighting for freedom, they were fighting for their lives and the survival of the world's most vulnerable populations. The resistance, though fractured at first, grew in strength as it received aid from unexpected sources. Some former enemies of McDuck, including those whose governments had been destabilized by his covert operations, began to share intelligence and resources with the rebels. These alliances were fragile, but they sparked the beginning of a global movement that sought to expose Scrooge's terrorism to the world. The resistance had one goal: to dismantle the global empire McDuck had built and hold him accountable for the destruction he had caused. The vault that Scrooge McDuck was so famously proud of, filled with countless gold coins and treasures, had become more than just a symbol of his wealth, it was a symbol of oppression. It was within this vault that the true nature of McDuck's empire could be seen: a structure built upon greed, manipulation, and a complete disregard for human lives. His wealth was not merely a byproduct of his business acumen, it was a weapon he wielded to maintain control over entire economies and governments. The vault, located beneath McDuck's mansion, was guarded not only by physical security but by a network of financial systems that ensured no one could access its contents without McDuck's approval. Those who tried to challenge McDuck's empire often found themselves buried beneath mountains of debt, bribery, and coercion, unable to escape his grip. The vault stood as a testament to the power he held over the world, no longer just a man's treasure, but a symbol of the terror he instilled in the global population. McDuck's story is one of the corruption of wealth and power. While many might believe that money alone is not enough to corrupt a man, Scrooge McDuck proved otherwise. His insatiable desire for more led him down a path where greed clouded his judgment, and his moral compass became warped. What began as a simple quest to build his fortune morphed into a relentless pursuit of control over markets, control over governments, and ultimately, control over people's lives. This corruption didn't just affect McDuck, it spread throughout his empire. Those who worked for him, or those who were aligned with his goals, became willing accomplices in his darker deeds. Business deals were no longer about fair competition, they were about crushing rivals, bribing officials, and sabotaging anyone who stood in the way. McDuck's empire was built on the exploitation of others, with no regard for the long-term consequences of his actions. Behind the scenes, as Scrooge McDuck's empire expanded, a shadow war was being waged, a war fought not with guns, but with money, influence, and information. McDuck's power was so vast that it often overshadowed traditional military conflicts. Instead, he fought wars through subversive tactics, spreading misinformation, manipulating the media, and destabilizing economies. These were battles fought in boardrooms, behind closed doors, and across the globe, where the lines between politics, business, and terror blurred. The Shadow War was a global battle for dominance. McDuck's empire, operating through financial terrorism, was quietly taking control of the world's wealth. His influence spread through international markets, making it difficult for any country to fight back. This silent war was one that no one saw coming, a battle not fought with soldiers, but with the power to control the flow of money, resources, and information. As Scrooge McDuck continued to exert his influence over the world's economies, a financial collapse began to loom. His network of corrupt dealings and influence in key financial institutions meant that any instability in one part of the world could quickly spread like wildfire. Countries that had once been stable found themselves on the brink of financial ruin, their economies teetering on the edge of collapse. At the same time, McDuck used his wealth to buy up distressed assets, further consolidating his power. The global economy had become a game, and McDuck was the master player. Nations were at his mercy, forced to accept his terms or face economic ruin. The rich got richer, while the poor suffered. The economic system that once seemed invincible was crumbling under the weight of McDuck's financial terrorism. And as the world's financial structures buckled, McDuck saw an opportunity to build something new, an empire where he could control everything, from the markets to the lives of millions of people. The world had begun to awaken to the true extent of Scrooge McDuck's influence. As the resistance grew stronger, the global powers began to realize that the fight for the future wasn't just about taking down McDuck, it was about restoring balance to the world's systems. Governments and private organizations that had once been aligned with McDuck now turned against him, forming a coalition to fight back against the empire he had built. The battle for the future of the world was no longer about military might or political diplomacy, it was about reshaping the global order. The resistance, now backed by nations and powerful corporations, launched a global campaign to expose McDuck's deeds. It was a battle for truth, for justice, and for the lives of millions who had suffered under his rule. The outcome of this battle would determine whether the world would remain in the grip of one man's greed, or whether it could break free and rebuild itself from the ashes of McDuck's empire. Despite his vast power and wealth, Scrooge McDuck's reign could not last forever. As the resistance and global powers closed in, McDuck found himself cornered. His empire began to crumble as key allies turned against him and his financial networks were dismantled. What had once been an untouchable fortress of greed and control was now vulnerable, with cracks appearing in its foundation. McDuck's carefully constructed world of manipulation began to collapse around him, and he was forced to confront the consequences of his actions. In a final attempt to retain his power, Scrooge tried to flee, but it was too late. His once vaunted vault, his treasure, and his global influence meant nothing now. The resistance had succeeded in bringing down the empire, and McDuck was forced to face the harsh reality of his own downfall. For the first time in his life, Scrooge McDuck was no longer the richest and most powerful duck in the world. He was a fallen tyrant, his empire in ruins. Scrooge McDuck's legacy was one of both admiration and terror. While many remembered him as a figure who overcame great odds to become incredibly wealthy, history would remember him for the devastation he caused in his pursuit of control. His empire, once built on the foundations of greed, left behind a trail of broken governments, destroyed economies, and lost lives. The world had been reshaped by McDuck's actions, and though his reign had ended, its effects would be felt for generations to come. In the end, Scrooge McDuck's legacy serves as a cautionary tale, a warning of what happens when wealth and power are allowed to run unchecked. His rise and fall are a stark reminder of how greed can lead to corruption, and how those who seek to dominate others can ultimately be undone by their own hubris. With Scrooge McDuck's empire dismantled, the world began to rebuild. The global powers worked together to restore order and stabilize the economies McDuck had manipulated. The resistance, now victorious, turned their attention to rebuilding the communities affected by McDuck's tyranny. It was a long and difficult road, but hope began to return. The world had learned a valuable lesson: power, when abused, leads to destruction. As the years passed, the scars of McDuck's reign faded, but the lessons remained. In the end, the world moved forward, more cautious and aware of the dangers of unchecked greed. Scrooge McDuck's name faded into history, but the story of his rise and fall would be told for generations to come, a reminder that no empire, no matter how powerful, is invincible. And that's the story of Scrooge McDuck's dark empire, one of greed, manipulation, and power. If you found this tale fascinating, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping stories. Stay tuned for our next documentary, and remember, sometimes the greatest threats come from the most unexpected places. Thanks for watching.